Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We are honored to have Florencia Torche, a professor of sociology at Stanford University. Florencia is a social scientist who has a lot of expertise in social demography, inequality, and education particularly. And she has published a lot in the areas of inequality dynamics, intergenerational mobility, disparities in educational attainment, associative matings, among many others. I am particularly a fan of her work on the very early life exposures on later life well-being. I have got the greatest chance to listen to her multiple times about this body of work that she has produced multiple studies on it. And she is an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is a really leading sociologist in the United States. We are lucky to have her, and also she's got a great amount of expertise and publications in Latin America. That's also particularly interesting for me and for many of the people in the audience. So today she will be talking about the normativity of marriage and the marriage premium for children's outcomes, co-authored work with Alejandra Bufele. And I'll leave the floor to Florencia. Before, I will remind everyone the rules of engagement that we have here. Today we have, if you have any clarification questions, Florencia indicated that she's happy to be interrupted for clarification questions. You type them on the chat and I will read out for you those clarification questions to Florencia. If you have substantive questions and comments, we will be leaving them to the end. So our allocated time slot is 90 minutes, but actually we will be stopping the recording at the 60th minute. Which will be 6:05 in London time. It will be 5:10 in Florencia's time. 5:10 in Florencia's time in the West Coast. So hopefully, and there will be a little bit more time for anyone who wants to follow up with further questions once we turn off the recording to talk to Florencia if the questions are there, and then we will be continuing as we do usually every week. So the floor is yours, Florencia. I just leave it, I'll just make myself here. Thank you so much for coming us. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this invitation. Can you hear me okay? Yes, perfect. All right. So I'm delighted to be here. It would be, I was telling Barca, it would be a lot nicer to be there in person with you. But we're gonna make do, right? We're all used to this by now. So I'm delighted to share this piece of work with you. Is a joint work with Alejandra Bufele, who is now at the Universidad Católica de Chile. Before further ado, let me jump into it. And as background, I want to tell you that in 1993, a law was proposed in Chile, which is the country setting for this study, that would have given all children equal rights, regardless of the marital status of their parents, erasing the distinction between legitimate children, those born to married parents, natural children, those born out of wedlock but recognized by the father, and so-called illegitimate children, those born out of wedlock and not recognized by the father, right? This distinction had important consequences for inheritance rights, for child support, even for admission into religious schools in the Chilean context. This proposal, this bill, faced staunch opposition among the conservative majority in Congress. Conservative lawmakers argued, among other things, that to eliminate the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate children without safeguards to protect the institution of marriage will gravely damage this fundamental core of society. The proposal was blocked in Congress, and after a substantial debate that lasted years, the law was only passed in 1998. If you think that this event that I'm telling you about is a vestige of, some kind of a traditional remnants in society, I would like to remind you that similar laws making distinctions in terms of children's rights based on the marital status of their parents have been in the books until, only a couple decades ago in the USA, and there are still in American society distinctions in children's rights based on the marital status of their parents. So with this, let me introduce this notion of the marriage premium, which is quite widespread. It's a relevant topic among social demographers, right? This refers to the fact that children born to married women experience better health, educational, behavioral, and economic outcomes throughout their life course. The disadvantage related to the marital status of their parents starts at birth, and the advantage persists throughout the life course. In this paper, in this analysis, we're going to focus on the marriage premium for infant health. That is, that infants born to married parents are less likely to be low weight, less likely to be preterm, and small for gestational age, net of observed differences between married and unmarried mothers. This is important. Research has documented that women who have a birth, married or non-married, are different from each other. But once you control for these observed covariates, the gap or the premium persists, right? Why do we care about these very early outcomes, right? Being born low weight or preterm. We care because infant health predicts individual long-term health, cognition, development, education, and economic well-being. So it's an important marker of resources at the starting gate of life, if you will. The marriage premium that has been documented in most societies that I am aware of, in every society I'm aware of actually, has been attributed to, on the one hand, an observed selectivity of married parents, right? Even if we control for these observed confounders, there might be still an observed selectivity of married parents, and to a plausible positive effect of marriage, right? Marriage is, and marriage advocates, this is the argument that's usually given. Marriage is good for individuals and for their children. And several mechanisms for the marriage premium have been suggested. They include, among others, that married women receive more emotional support and instrumental assistance, have a better mental health due to their marital status. Spouses help them monitor and promote healthy behaviors, such as, going to receiving prenatal care and so on. And has also been attributed to a higher sense of pregnancy wantedness and responsibility because of the marital bond, right? This is, and there are other hypothesized mechanisms. So all these mechanisms refer to the mother's individual level resources, behaviors, and interactions, right? We're going to suggest here that the beneficial effect of marriage, if there is one, is contextual. That is, it emerges from the normativity of marriage in society. It's a particular type of a contextual effect. And here is how it goes. In a context in which marriage is a normative institution in society, non-marital fertility will be a source of stigma, shaping interactions with relatives, friends, neighbors, and critically institutions, right, such as healthcare providers and others, and thereby shaping the access to resources and the conceptions of self of that unmarried mother or pregnant woman, I should say. In other words, we're offering a kind of a bold hypothesis, right? We are suggesting that being born to married parents is better for children than being born to counterfactually identical unmarried parents, because marital fertility is normative in society. This hypothesis is acknowledgedly quite bold, right? But there is substantial descriptive evidence, at least, that makes this contextual effect based on normativity plausible. I'm going to give you a set of examples just to make our inquiry plausible. Research suggests that the effect of several practices or statuses that describe individuals can emerge from their normativity. For instance, their negative association between young people's obesity and their academic achievement, their grades, is stronger, that is more negative, in schools where obesity is uncommon. So in schools where everyone is thin, being obese carries more of a penalty. And the explanation that could be given here is that in those cases, obesity in school where everyone is thin, obesity represents a stronger violation of a norm, right? By the same token, the negative association between parents' divorce and children's health is stronger, again, more negative, in contexts where divorce is rare. Again, the explanation is that when divorce is rare, experiencing parental divorce is more unexpected and more stigmatized, right? Research has also found that the detrimental effect of unemployment on people's subjective well-being is more detrimental when unemployment is unusual, when you are the exception to the norm. And finally, a favorite example of mine, the association between female educational hypogamy and divorce. Okay, for the non-demographers, female educational hypogamy means a marriage in which the wife has more education than the husband, right? So the association between this couple configuration and divorce has declined dramatically over time as female hypogamy becomes more common, because it's more common, more normative, more accepted to have a couple in which the wife has more education than the husband, right? So all these examples and many more provide, yield plausibility to the hypothesis that we're going to test. We still need some kind of a theoretical formulation of a mechanism here, right? And basically, this is what we're proposing. I'm going to rely on the kind of standard formulation by Coleman, linking macro level phenomena to micro level interactions. Because what I'm proposing basically is my hypothesis about a macro level phenomenon, right? I'm saying the normativity of marriage in a particular society, in a particular aggregate context, right? A country at a time point and so on, determines the marriage premium for infant health, right? This is the macro level association that I'm interested in. And I'm saying that this is plausible because the social normativity of marriage in society will result in differential status and treatment of married and unmarried mothers, right? Where in particular unmarried mothers can be subject to stigma and potentially even discrimination, although it's usually more subtle than overt discrimination. And then it is this differential status and treatment of unmarried moms, which in turn will shape the mother's access to resources, conceptions of self, behaviors, and access, and so on. And that in turn will shape a particular level of the marriage premium for infant health in society, right? So this is the kind of the conceptual model that we're working with. All right, so let me pause. Well, it's rather early, but if there is any clarification point at this point, do let me know.
None so far, Florencia.
Okay, great. So we can keep going. All right. So the hypothesis I've suggested is, you may consider it to be of a theoretical interest, but if marital fertility were to be universal or near universal, across societies, this question wouldn't have much, empirical relevance or policy relevance, right? That's not the case, however. This question is important because marital fertility has declined quite substantially in virtually all Western countries in the last few decades, leading to a growing decoupling, basically, as predicted by the second demographic transition between marriage and childbearing, right? Let me show you some data on this. So this graph is going to show you the percentage of births that are to married women, right? The change of this percentage between 1990 in the dark gray and 2016 in the light gray. And we have a sample of OECD countries. And what we show very clearly, what we see very clearly here is across these countries, there has been a consistent decline in marital fertility, from a relatively minor decline to an extremely large decline between 90 and 2016, right? And this applies to North America, Europe, and also Latin America, here, represented here with Mexico, but this is very similar in other Latin American countries, right? This substantial decline, which makes the question rather relevant in my opinion. As relevant as it might be, examining this question empirically is quite challenging, right? Let me formulate this, since I know there are some students here. Let me formulate this as, how can we test the hypothesis that the marriage premium for infant health depends on the normativity of marriage in society? And I'm going to start by saying what current evidence suggests, right? There's some research, not specifically on this question as formulated as strongly as I'm formulating here, as, you know, the causal effect of the normativity of marriage, but there's some descriptive research with which I'm gonna start. So there's some cross-sectional evidence suggesting that countries with a higher prevalence of non-marital fertility have a weaker marriage premium for infant health. So this supports the hypothesis, right? Longitudinal evidence within country is, however, all over the place, to put it informally, right? As marital fertility has declined in many countries, in countries where this has been examined, the marriage premium for infant health has been found to decrease in some cases, increase in some other cases, and further stay the same in others, right? Of course, this highlights the relevance of unobserved confounding here, right? Both in cross-sectional and longitudinal comparisons, they're unobserved factors, right? Attributes of countries or unobserved trends over time that might confound the association of interest between changes in the normativity of marital fertility and changes in the marriage premium. So to start thinking about this, it would be a plausible testing setting, a plausible testing case here is one in which marital fertility varies substantially both over time and across place, right? And I found this setting, this case in Chile. Let me start by showing you some evidence. So marital fertility has dropped quite dramatically in Chile, from 66% of all births in 1990 to only 27%, so a bit more than a quarter of all births in 2016. As you see, this decline is kind of rather linear, right, and rather substantial. This is a massive decline when it comes to instances of social change. So this provides a promising case study, right? And then I show you this graph already, but when we add Chile to this graph, this comparative graph, as you can see, the decline in Chile in our case study is quite substantial, right? All right. Let me clarify at the outset. The decline in marital fertility that I show you in Chile did not naturally take place in a social and economic and cultural vacuum, right? It took place in context of a broad demographic, economic, and cultural transformation. That includes educational expansion, the decline and postponement of fertility, and importantly, ideational changes that destigmatize behaviors previously subject to strong normative restrictions, including, for instance, premarital cohabitation, divorce, abortion, and homosexuality, right? This is going to become important later on. So for now, I'm just introducing this as a descriptive point, but then I will need to deal with these issues as potential sources of confounding, right? All right. With this, we have, I think, a very concise version of all we need to move on to the actual analysis. So in terms of the data we used, we're going to rely on restricted access natality data based on all birth records in the country between 1990 and 2016. And these records were prepared for us, including a masked mother's IDs, right? This is, therefore, we're dealing with a population level data. We have a census of births, which is very convenient in terms of, with virtually no selectivity. In this context, in Chile, virtually all births in the country are registered, which is an enormous advantage. The trade-off is the birth records, the birth certificate doesn't include much information about the mother, right? There are things that we are missing. In terms of analysis, we're going to proceed in 4 analytical steps. First, we're going to start with a very descriptive approach that assesses temporal variation, right? This is what much research, the research that I've discussed does. So the idea is to examine trends in the association between the marital status of the mother and infant health, right? Measured by 3 indicators: low birth weight, preterm birth, and small for gestational age birth, as marital fertility becomes less normative over time. I choose these 3 indicators of infant health because they're widely used in the, in the research community, as in particular important as indicators in terms of assessing the well-being of the population and deciding policy, right? And as you may know, preterm birth and small for gestational age birth are the only 2 proximate determinants of low birth weight. I can talk a lot more about this, but for now, we're going to only say that. So this is very basic descriptive change over time in the marriage premium as marriage becomes less normative in this society. Second, we're going to move to spatial variation, right? And here we're going to examine the association between the marital status of the mother and these birth outcomes across localities, across localities with different prevalence of marital fertility. So this cross-sectional variation will provide, in the best possible case, it will provide a source of non-trivial replication, right? Where there is other factors shaping variation. Third, we're going to move to implementing, to using mother fixed effects models, right? To examine the effect of the mother's marital status comparing births within mom, that is comparing siblings, in order to address and observe confounders that emerge from characteristics of the women, right? And finally, we're going to offer a falsification test to examine the effect of other statuses, not, a non-marital birth, that have not become normative. And I'm going to explain all of this in detail as we move on. But this is kind of the roadmap. I'm pausing in case someone has a question. All right.
Questions being posted here. So if, like, just a reminder for the latecomers, if you have any clarification questions, please post them on the chat. I'll read Florencia later.
Great. All right. So so let's see what we find. We're going to start with the basic descriptive analysis of change over time, right? And you're going to see a lot of these graphs, so I'm going to try and explain how they were constructed with this one. So what we have here is over time, so across years from 1990 to 2016, we have a parameter estimate capturing the effect of the, well, effect, I'm using it as a shortcut. This is not, you know, a causal effect, right? But I'm going to just say effect. The effect of the mom being married compared to non-married, of course, right? This is a binary distinction on, in this case, the probability that the baby is born low weight, right? So this minus 0.05, the negative number indicates an advantage. It means a lower probability, a 1.5 percentage point reduction in the probability of being born low weight for the births of the married moms compared to unmarried moms. Right, so let me provide more information about this first triangle, the parameter estimate. The vertical lines, oops, I'm so sorry, are a 95% confidence intervals, of course, right? So in 1990, for instance, the percentage of low birth weight was 6.3 among unmarried moms, but only 4.8 among married moms. So there is a difference of 1.5 percentage points. This is what is graphed here, right? Which captures the substantial. This, I mean, the number is small, but that means, you know, in terms of the percentages we're talking about, is a substantial advantage of being born to a married mom in 1990. So this graph is based on year-specific linear probability models for, you know, over time. And what we see here is that the marriage premium, right, the lower probability of being born low weight because you had a married mom as opposed to an unmarried mom, that marriage premium substantially declines over time. The vertical line is 0, means no difference, and you see by 2010, more or less, the marriage premium was extremely small, and some years it didn't exist, right? This is low birth weight. Let's move to the other two, the two proximate determinants of low weight. So we have the same analysis for preterm birth and for small for gestational age, and the pattern is exactly the same. You see that here for preterm birth, there is a slight advantage, if you will, to being born to an unmarried mom. You shouldn't read too much into that, just because the magnitude of the parameter estimate is very close to 0, and because we're not accounting for any observed attribute of the mom, right? This is just the most basic descriptive analysis. But it shows that, you know, there is a trend to be explained that is consistent with the hypothesis, or the hypothesis consistent with the trend, I should say. You know, we use reality as the benchmark. So, so let's, as a second descriptive step, account for these unobserved characteristics of the mom, right? So now we're gonna account for the usual suspects, things that attributes of women that we know are correlated with both their marginal status and the birth outcomes of their children. And this includes age, mother's age, educational attainment, parity, urban residence, region of the country of residence, and infant sex. When we do that for birth weight and for the other two determinants of birth weight, the pattern persists. We find for each outcome a decline or even disappearance of the marriage premium, right? As marital fertility becomes less normative, the gaps are smaller now because we're accounting for these characteristics, right? But but the pattern holds nonetheless.
Florencia, there's one question. Tammy is asking whether you could disaggregate the unmarried moms into partners being registered at birth versus not present or not involved, or do you just like have a crude distinction between these two? And Mary Alice,
excellent question.
Sorry, there's a question maybe. Mary Alice is asking a data question, whether do you have many mothers who don't report their marital status, or how do you deal with that? Thank you.
Yes, very good question. So the first one is whether I could disaggregate the partnership, say, status of unmarried moms, and in particular, whether I could identify mothers in which the father is perhaps absent. There's some things I can do, much I can't. In particular, I cannot identify the cohabitation status of the mom, which is very important. So I appreciate this question, and in a couple slides, I'm gonna talk, and then throughout the presentation, I'm gonna talk a lot about that. It's a very important question, right? Because it speaks to the composition of the unmarried births based on factors that may matter for their outcome. So stay tuned, there's gonna be a lot more on this. If towards the end, I haven't fully addressed your question, by all means, let me know. The second is about data quality, I think, and it's whether the missing data for the mother's marital status is substantial. It's not substantial at all. It's very, very limited. Actually, in general, birth records are of impressive quality here. In this country, there's for many historical reasons, record keeping in this domain has been extremely good quality, and there is seemingly a certain culture of providing information. I cannot evaluate the accuracy of that information, but I haven't seen in the literature or in informal reports any indication that is particularly poor accuracy. So I would say it's quite excellent data based on all sorts of analysis that researchers have done, and the sheer frequencies, of course.
One more question added in the last minute, Florencia, if you don't mind. So that, like, in your graphs, there's a decline from 1990 to 2008, asks Maria, but then a slight increase in the difference between married and unmarried moms for almost all outcomes. Do you have any hypothesis on what's driving this?
No, it's true. There is a slight, variation. I wouldn't make a whole lot of this, just because, as you know, of course, the parameter estimate, the confidence intervals fully, overlap with each other, right? Although, as a minor side note, this is population level data, so make it as you want of these confidence intervals. But there's still some sort of randomness, of course, an error in this data, some sort of variability. My inclination is I don't want to make a whole lot of this until I get 1 or 2 more years of data, so to see if there's a certain indication of trend, right, that I could, more confidently interpret. And in fact, we're working now with more current data, but for now, I would say there's slight indication of, some potential increase of this gap, but nothing else.
So there are more questions, but there are more substantive questions that we can leave it at the end for the discussion. I think the clarification questions are over. Thank you.
Alrighty. So this is step number 1, a descriptive step, to the extent in particular you believe that these usual suspects, right, these variables, attributes of the mom I'm controlling for are not sufficient, right, to account for unobserved selectivity of women who marry. Let me take the first, provide the first answer to the first question, which has to do with the distinction among unmarried moms between cohabiting unmarried moms and single unmarried or non-cohabiting unmarried moms, right? This distinction is particularly important in the US, where a lot has been said about cohabitation and the so-called cohabitation boom, right? And as you know, if you're a social demographer, there's a big discussion about the status of cohabitation, if it's just marriage without a piece of paper, or if it's a separate different status, and so on. So be it as it may, research has found quite consistently that infants born to cohabiting mothers do better in terms of health outcomes than infants born to unpartnered or so-called single moms, right? So if growing non-marital fertility has been accompanied by a growing share of cohabitations versus single moms among the non-marital births, then this very compositional change could explain a decline in the marriage premium, right? Cohabitations are increasing. Cohabitations are pretty similar to marriage. Of course, babies are doing better. The marriage premium is declining because the difference between cohabiting and married couples is small. Well, unfortunately, the birth certificates don't include information about the cohabiting status of the mother. That's a major limitation. But we can rely on ancillary data. We use a large repeated cross-sectional data set in Chile in order to to estimate the proportion of non-marital births that are to a cohabiting couple versus those who are born to a single mother, right? And as you see, this is what we found using the modified version of the own children method, very well established in demography. So the dashed line is the decline in marital births from this survey. It's extremely consistent with what we find from birth records. So this is great. It's just, you know, a check. But what concerns us here is the trends in terms of single births to single women, the solid line, and births to cohabiting women, right? The partition of these non-marital births in the dotted line. And as you can see here, the increase is virtually identical. It's pretty similar, except for the last couple years in which there's kind of a plateau among single births. So this idea that the decline in the marital, the marriage premium is due to a disproportional increase in cohabitations and therefore a compositional change just cannot be. What we find in the Chilean case, which might not be the case as in other cases, and which actually contradicts much of the conventional wisdom in Chile, is not that the increase in non-marital fertility is not driven by a cohabitation boom. It's equal parts cohabitation boom and singlehood boom, right? So, okay, this is the first answer to the question about the composition of non-marital births, but there's more to it. Let me move to the second component of the analysis, and this is the spatial variation in the marriage premium across local contexts. We reason as follows: is the hypothesized association between the normativity of marriage and the marriage premium is correct, we should find a cross-sectional association between the marriage premium and the prevalence of marital fertility across localities too, right? And this, as I said, provides a nice non-trivial replication. We're using a different source of variation in the normativity of marriage, hopefully subject to different sources of confounding, right? So we're going to examine the variation in the marriage premium by the prevalence of marital fertility in the mother's municipality of residence, right, across place. And we're going to restrict the analysis here to 1990 to 99, just because in that decade, the marriage premium was so substantial, so it provides a better testing ground. But of course, we did it for every period, we find the same, except things are more attenuated in more recent years because the marriage premium is more attenuated, right? So here's what we found. This is based on a multi-level model with random slopes and random intercepts. And what we find here, I'm showing here is in the x-axis, the proportion of births to unmarried women in the municipality, right? And we plot here a range that goes from the 1st to the 99th percentile in this proportion, right? Which is a meaningful range. So in the municipalities in which marriage is quite prevalent, only 17% of the births were to unmarried women. But in other municipalities where non-marital births were a lot more prevalent, more than half of births were to unmarried women. And here what we compare is the probability of low birth weight for unmarried women, solid line, and married women, dotted line. And as you can see very clearly here, the marriage premium is the vertical difference, the vertical distance between the lines, of course, right? In contexts where marital fertility is very prevalent, the marriage premium is large. This vertical line is long. But as non-marital fertility becomes more prevalent, the marriage premium shrinks to disappear, right? This is low birth weight. Let me show you preterm birth and small for gestational age. We find a quite similar pattern, which is not surprising because the combination of these latter two gives you birth weight. So we find evidence that is consistent again with our hypothesis that the marriage premium, the gap right in outcomes between married and unmarried moms, shrinks as non-marital fertility becomes more normative. Now the context is the local, the spatial context, it's not time, right? But we find the same. All right, this is number 2. Let's move to number 3. Number 3 is the marriage premium across births of the same mother. The rationale for this is the following: the association between the marriage premium and the normativity of marriage could be driven by the composition of women who marry. Of course, that's a main concern in this kind of analysis, right? As non-marital fertility becomes more accepted, more normative in society, women who have a birth outside of marriage may become more positively selected or less negatively selected, as the case might be, based on unobservables that concern us. So that this may be a story of unobserved selectivity only on who decides to marry over time, right? So we're going to conduct a temporal analysis identical to the one I showed to you. Well, it's more parameterized, but it's the same, right? But we're going to use mother fixed effects models. So basically, we're going to compare births of the same mother in which the mom had one birth when married, another birth when unmarried. This is a relatively powerful strategy because by comparing births within mom, we naturally control for any unobserved characteristic of the mom. If that characteristic doesn't change over time across births in this case, with this methodology. Okay, so we're going to repeat our exercise, but using a sample of siblings and in using a fixed effects formulation. And this is what we find. We parameterize this, but it's the same if we were to take the year specific coefficient. It's just we have less data, so this formulation it's kind of more parsimonious. So what we find here over time, only from 1992, the records with mother's ID for 1990 and 91 are not existent in the Chilean Ministry of Health. Okay, from 92 to 2016, we find exactly the same as before. When you compare births across marital status of the same mom, you see a substantial decline of the marriage premium to a full disappearance, right, in the 2010s. This is low birth weight, this is preterm birth, and this is small for gestational age birth. You see exactly the same or a very similar pattern, right? Using our sibling sampling and sampling, this more powerful methodology is if the attempt is to capture a causal effect, which is in our case. Finally, let's move to the falsification test, and this also refers to the first question that was asked about the composition of unmarried births. The fixed effects formulation addresses unobserved characteristics of the woman who gives birth, right? but there's another source of confounding that should concern us, and it's the following. Contextual changes other than the normativity of marriage may account for the decline in the marriage premium. And I told you at the beginning, over time in Chile, many things change other than the normativity of marriage, right? There was a demographic change, legal change, cultural, and particularly important, ideational change, right? The society became more liberal, more progressive. Progressive is a loaded term, but more accepting of diverse lifestyles, right? So it might be that change and not particularly the normativity of marriage that shaped our observed outcome, right? This is a very interesting question to me. It doesn't invalidate my findings, but rather kind of displaces the analysis of their root cause. What is it? Is it the declining normativity of marriage, or is it the growing openness in society in general? So to try to push this very hard question, or to provide a preliminary answer to this very hard question, ideally I would need a counterfactual case with an identical contextual change over time as the one observed, right? The same normative, cultural, demographic change, but where the normativity of the specific practice or status that I'm analyzing, in this case, non-marital fertility, did not change. Well, easier said than that, this counterfactual world, but we were lucky to find a setting in which to find a practice or status that fits that criterion. And that status is the case in which the birth was to an unknown or absent father, right? So we can distinguish births to unknown or absent fathers based on the birth certificate. How do we do that? We operationalize it as it's standard in the literature as the following: when the father information is fully missing in the birth certificate, but other information is provided, so the mother information is provided, right? But the father information is all missing, that is, it has been demonstrated, a very good indicator that the father is unknown or completely absent from the woman's life, right? And these births to unknown or absent fathers are, the literature cares about them because they're particularly vulnerable. So I'm going to use this for the following reason. Look at these trends. This is Chile, again, 1990, 2016. And here we have the trends in married, the dash dot dot is married births. We have seen this trend like 1,000 times, right? Then the solid line is unmarried births to an unmarried mom, but with a present or known father. And the dashed line is births to an unmarried mom, but with an absent or unknown father, operationalized as I just explained. As you can see, this line is virtually flat at 10%. So many things change in society. The proportion of unmarried births changed dramatically, but the proportion of births to an unknown or absent father remains quite constant. That provides a nice, a research opportunity, because if it's really a broad normative change that shapes the outcomes, we should observe a decline in the penalty associated with these births. But if it's specifically the normativity of these births, as you can see, they haven't changed over time at all, right? So we shouldn't expect any change associated with the penalty in terms of birth outcome for having an unknown or absent father. So we're going to repeat our analysis, but comparing now the marriage premium, comparing the marriage premium with births to absent or unknown fathers only. And as you see, There's very little change over time. Sure, there is variation. Sure, there's a little increase, a little decrease. But if you compare this amount of variation with the variation of the marital premium in general, you see that there's more indication of stability here, which is quite consistent with our hypothesis, right? The prevalence of absent and births to absent and no father hasn't changed, nor has the marriage premium compared to these births changed so much. And this is actually, oops, I'm sorry about this. This is actually driven by slight increase in the penalty for preterm births, a slight decline in the penalty for small for gestational age birth. These changes are relatively minor, overall quite stability, which provides some evidence supporting the claim that it is specifically the normativity of marriage and not other changes in society, right? Other cultural and normative ideational changes in society. All right, I'm going to wrap up quickly and start the conversation. So evidence based on temporal variation across place, mother fixed effects, and this falsification exercise suggests that the marriage premium for infant health declines as marital fertility becomes less normative in society, right? In context where marital fertility is less normative in society. Marriage, therefore, appears not to have benefits for infant health beyond the advantages emerging from its normativity and recognition in society. Net, of course, of the characteristics of women who do marry and do not marry, of course, right? When I've shared these findings with some sociology colleagues, some of them have said, well, quite expected, it's all about the social context. So as aligned with sociological intuition as this finding might be, it has been quite neglected both by the empirical analysis of the consequences of non-marital fertility and by the entire policy debate, right, about how to address it. And even beyond this case, and probably more interestingly, right, this is only one practice or status. In this case, having a child outside of wedlock in a particular context. But a similar effect of normativity of different practices and statuses could apply to the effect of a wide range of practices and status defined as non-normative in specific social contexts. You can think of, for instance, sexual preferences, identities or orientations. You can think of specific religious beliefs, and so on and so forth. So with that, thank you so much, and I would love to take questions or comments.
So thank you, Florencia, for a wonderful talk. It was super interesting. We have a few questions already on the chat function. So I'll go from the methodological questions to a little bit more substantive questions first. So I think the first question, like more methods oriented, is coming from Gudong. He's asking whether the sequence of the married and unmarried birth, can you say a bit more about it? And he says, I wonder if the married first birth and unmarried first birth have the same difference or not. And I'll read out the questions, and then if you can take notes, because you might have coming more. The second question comes from Tammy. She's asking whether, have you tried this? Would be interesting to see what happens if you interact with the birth order of the child in the fixed effect sibling models, or looking at subsamples where the same ordering of the marriage birth for the interactions, I think. And then there is this question from Rosia. Rosia says she's got two questions that are related to more policy. One of them is basically about whether you have any data regarding how these birth weights relate to which type of health system the mother accesses to, public versus private, or since the privatization of systems are restrictive for even the middle classes, what do you think are the implications for the policy, social policies in Chile in terms of your results? I think part of that question is being answered in your conclusions, but I just read out anyway. So far you got 3 questions, but I'm sure more will be coming.
Alrighty, okay. Let's start with the first one, which is about the sequence of births, a very interesting question. We did a lot with that. As you know, one of the attributes of the fixed effects formulation is that it relies on a deviation from means estimator. So you lose the sequence, right? But considering the different transitions, I would talk more about transitions, but the person who asked the question could tell me if this is what they meant, right? Transitions is interesting, meaning the transition from an unmarried to a married birth can have a different effect than the transition from a married to an unmarried birth, right? And this provides additional information. We cannot do that in a fixed effects formulation setting, but we can do that using a first difference formulation, right? And restricting this to 2 births. So we did quite a bit of that. We cannot use the setting is very different. But I'm going to show you what we found because it's rather consistent, right? So like I said, the first, basically the fixed effects model is based on the assumption that the effect of the transition into marriage is the same, but opposite in sign to the transition out of marriage. When we distinguish between the two and we compare, we cannot use the same setting, so we're comparing what happens in the early period when marriage was normative and in the later period when marriage was non-normative. And what we found in the early period is that the transition to marriage had a negative coefficient, which means a positive effect, a reduction in low birth weight preterm and small for gestational age birth. The transition out of marriage had a negative effect, a positive coefficient. So, both transitions had effects that were expected and quite symmetrical, interestingly to us, rather, actually. But in a later period, no significant effects, as we should expect, right? In this later period when non-marital fertility was normative in Chile, then neither transition had a significant effect. So surprisingly to us, the effect of transitions was quite symmetrical in terms of outcomes. And I can say a lot more. We have thought a lot about that, but for now, given that there's several questions, I'm going to stop here. Then in terms of birth order, yeah, we did a little bit. We found this formulation using the transition formulation a little bit more informative. The issue with birth order is that, of course, as fertility declines, then birth orders rather than 2 are rather unusual and perhaps very selective. So we couldn't do as much as we would have wanted to, and we didn't. I'm trying to remember. I don't think we found anything, more relevant to report. Oh, of course, birth order. That well, anyway. So I'm not remembering more details on that, but I don't remember finding something more novel to an additional learning from that. Then in terms of social policies for Chile and beyond, I don't know if I have a very direct, the direct implication is this research strongly suggests, it's hard to prove this hypothesis, extremely hard to prove, right? And we really did as much as possible, but strongly suggests that a main driver of the negative impact of having unmarried parents is a societal reaction, right? When non-marital fertility is non-normative, then there's processes such as stigmatization, right? That results in negative reactions by individuals or institutions that might be detrimental for the mother, for the pregnant woman, and then for their child, right? Their children. The main policy implication from that is don't discriminate, basically. Don't act differently based on the marital status or any other attribute that is non-normative of individuals, right? I don't think I need, this just adds basically to a body of research that would suggest that the normativity of a practice or status may induce these negative responses in the population, and that may be very real in terms of their consequences. That's not a very direct implication, but I think it's nonetheless very important to say that indeed it might be the case that this is all a social process, and there's nothing beyond that that would harm the children of non-marital births, just to add to growing openness and acceptance of diverse lifestyles in society. But this with the following caveat. Of course, I cannot measure those micro level, as I explained in the beginning, mechanisms, right? This research at least cannot measure these processes, these interactional processes of stigmatization, blocking access to resources, withdrawing resources, and so on to unmarried moms. That part I cannot see in this research, right? So this is indirect evidence, and there is other research that may consider those interactional phenomena.
Thank you, Florencia. We like David Brady, who's going to be our speaker in a couple of weeks, is here and ask him a question through privately. David, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question directly? Because it's I'm not sure whether I'll express it as well as best as you will.
Hi, Florencia. Hope you're well. Thanks for the wonderful
Dave,
talk.
hi, it's you. It's this Dave. Good to hear you.
Yeah, good to hear you. Thanks for the great talk. It was fascinating. I was wondering how you think of like policy or / institutional change as part of this causal model. And I was thinking I could kind of imagine 3 possibilities. One is that it's an underlying cause of the normative change. Or it could be a competing cause that's actually incorporated into your models. And I was trying to think this through in terms of like the fixed effects and over time. Or it could be an unobserved confound. And I'm sure you thought about this, so I just wanted to help understand, how do we think of policy institutional change versus normative change?
Right. What do you mean by underlying and competing in this setting?
So like underlying, it could be that like behind the normative change, there was originally policy and institutional change, like legalization of divorce or something that triggers the normative change, in which case you think normative change might be just fascinating as the mechanism by which policies matter, or independently. And then unobserved, I was thinking like, would it be that what we think is a normative change is just, I don't think this is true, but is it just purely policy change and not normative change? And I'm trying to think if that would show up as an unobserved confound, but I can't think this through.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this area of research. I haven't thought as hard about this as I should, so I really appreciate the considerations. But I certainly consider the possibility. My inclination, Dave, and everyone at the moment is this has the order of causation is the other way around, meaning it's societal change that basically leads to a certain policy change that just basically, let me put it strongly, kind of certifies the status quo. And this is, I mean, there's a literature on this, as you know, there's much work in this, in which basically the suggested hypothesis here is that policies come later in the game and simply express and make even more formally evident a transformation that has already occurred. The best piece of evidence in this case to me is just you remember I started this talk by talking about this very important legal and policy change that eliminated the differences in rights across type of between children across the marital statuses of their parents. Well, so let me return to those differences between so-called legitimate, natural, and illegitimate children in Chile were deeply ingrained in culture and practice. And, you know, if there are Chilean students here, the notion, the social notion of the huacho, the child without a father, is a terrible notion that really permeates culture, right? Well, this law was quite debated, quite relevant. It's a, you know, it's a legal change that caused a substantial policy change. What do you observe in terms of the outcomes? At that time, in 1999, very little, virtually nothing, right? There's no change in trend. Well, there's no change in marital fertility, right? In the marital fertility trend, there is at all. Based on this law, there's no change in the outcomes at all, suggesting to me that this law basically just, you know, certified and codified something, a change that had already occurred in society. And I don't want to be too strong because I haven't studied this, but my suspicion is that in this field, that's very much what you will find, that the legal and policy change is a very late indicator of substantial social transformations. Again, I don't want to get into the endogenous, you know, relationships between you know, social and normative change and policy change, because there's a lot more to that. But in this particular setting, I would say that's more accurate.
Thank you, Florencia. We have 2 more comments, questions, but I want to stop recording from this point onwards because we have 1 hour full. And if anyone who wants to leave the room at this stage or have to leave, we booked the time slots until 6:30. Florencia, your time 10:30, so you got like another 15 minutes. I guess there's going to be some more questions for you, but the recording will be over from here onwards, and anyone who wants to leave, they're free to leave.